Hey guys, thanks for being a part of our online community here at Central.Church, and especially checking out this weekend's Weekend Thoughts. We are in week 2 of Miracles, a series that will carry us through the rest of this year. And this past weekend, we spent some time looking into the life of Jesus and the disciples. We find them on a boat. Jesus is asleep. The storm comes about. And through the eyes of Mark, he shares with us that the disciples, they wake Jesus up. We see this dialogue between Jesus and the disciples. We finally see Jesus actually speak into nature, where he commands the winds and the waves, the storm, to be still. And if you haven't been able to be a part of this weekend, then let me just encourage you to hit pause right now, go over and listen to this past weekend's message, and then come back and check out this weekend's thoughts. In the message this weekend, I used this phrase: if you or I don't do the desert well with God, then most likely, probably, we won't do the promised land well with God. If we don't do the desert well with God, then we probably are not going to do the promised land well with God. Over in the Old Testament, we see where Moses is commissioned by God to go and talk to Pharaoh about releasing the children of Israel from being enslaved by the Egyptians. And there we see the 10 plagues that God brings about because Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and we see that the Israelites aren't released until finally, after the last plague, after the killing of the firstborn, after the death angel, finally we see that Pharaoh calls Moses in and releases the children of Israel out of being enslaved by the Egyptians. And we see that the children of Israel leaving the land of Egypt, headed to what we call the promised land, a land that had been promised to them by God. And when they finally get to the promised land, we see that these spies are sent out. And when the spies come out back, they share with all the people, they share with them saying, this is an amazing land. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. But there's these giants, there's these enemies, there's these warriors, and there's no way possible we can take this land. But there's 2 spies by the name of Joshua and Caleb. They say, you know what, that's correct. There are these giants, there are these warriors. Yes, it's going to be hard, but this land is flowing with milk and honey. It is an amazing place. And on top of that, reminds the people, hey, God promised this land to us, and God will be with us. We believe we should go into this land that has been promised to us. But the people listened to the other spies and not to Joshua and Caleb. And there we see that for the next 40 years, a journey that, if you really look at the distance between Egypt and this land, this promised land, should only take a matter of days. We actually see the children of Israel, they wander around in this wilderness for 40 years, waiting for generation to die off because their faith, they didn't fear God enough to let go of their fears and allow God to lead them into the promised land. Now let's take a step back. They've been a part of watching God move in their life. God has delivered them from the hands of the Egyptians. Through now having to wander around in the wilderness, we know that God is with them by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. There's a time in the Israelites' life as they're wandering around. There's a time in the Israelites' life where, or we see initially they complain because, has God led us out into this wilderness just to starve to death? So what does God do? He feeds them what we know as manna. We see that they finally get to the point that they get tired of manna and they want something else to eat. So God provides them with something else to eat. We know that they complain because God led them out to die of thirst, and God provided water for them. All throughout this time in the wilderness, God provides for them. Over and over and over again, they come in contact with God, the supernatural, the miraculous of God. They get to see God move. There's a time when Moses goes up on the mountain to gather up the 10 Commandments. This time between God and Moses in this dialogue. And down in the bottom in the valley, we see that the Israelites, because Moses has been gone for a while, they think that Moses isn't coming back. And they have this bright idea that they need something physical, something tangible, something they can touch to worship. So therefore they create this golden calf to worship. All throughout the time that we see that they are actually in the Exodus, that they're actually in the wilderness, wandering around, time and time again, as God is moving, we see them mess up. They never do the desert well with God. So finally, when we see the time for Moses to die and Joshua to lead the people into the promised land, we see that the children of Israel get into the promised land. And although they have miraculous success, they have amazing success by the hands of God, defeating the various enemies, we see that over and over again, that instead of them influencing culture, culture influences them. It influences them with the way they live. It influences them with the way that they worship God. They allow some aspects of culture to enter into their life that instead of being drawn closer to God, it absolutely puts more of a divide between them and God. They ask God to provide them with a king. Again, something tangible, something physical, something that they can put their eyes upon. So God gives them their first king in what we see in King Saul. We see this over and over and over again in the life of the children of Israel. We see that they didn't do the desert well, and then when they get into the promised land, they can't do the promised land well. They get to the point that they worship idols, and they allow all these different aspects of this idolatry of worship to enter into their lives, till finally we see that they're raising up a generation that doesn't know God. When I say they don't really know God, they've lost sight of who God is, till finally, get this, finally we see that it's estimated that for 400 years, that God doesn't send a prophet to them. In other words, God is silent in the form of speaking to them through a prophet. Now, it isn't that God is not working. It isn't that God isn't moving. It's just He's not moving in this aspect of sending them a prophet, speaking to them through a prophet for just made it 400 years. Now, if you go back and we look, that during this 400-year span, God was actually moving. And even a lot of the prophecies we see there early on in the Old Testament are actually being fulfilled and carried out through this 400 years. But we don't actually see God speak again. Get this, we don't actually see Him speak again until we see over in the New Testament when John the Baptist shows up on the scene, and then we see the birth of Jesus, and we see Jesus and His ministry and all that takes place. If we don't learn to do the desert well with God, then most likely, when the promised land comes about, we won't do the promised land well with God either. If we don't learn to fear God, and in this weekend's message, we talk about this idea of God is not saying that with the fear, that yes, fear is going to rise up, but in those times when fear rises up in our lives, in the good and the bad, in the deserts, in the promised land, how do we deal with that fear? How do we wrestle with that fear, that the fear doesn't keep us from actually accomplishing what God wants? In other words, we allow anxiety, we allow struggles, we allow all these things to well up inside of us. Where we talked about this weekend, and you can go back again and refresh yourself, or hit pause and go back and listen to this weekend's message. But really, when God says, not to be afraid, or do we still have, or tells the disciples, or talking about their idea of being afraid, in other words, saying, do you still don't fear God? See, when we have this fear of God, then it kind of gives us a calmness. We can, in the desert or in the promised land, because of our fear of God, because of our faith, that we know that we are okay. Maybe the circumstance is not okay. The circumstance, it may be absolutely horrible. This time in the desert might just be something just absolutely just catastrophic. But no matter how bad it is, we're okay. No matter how good it is, we're okay. Why? Because of God. Because of God. You know, when you look into the life of David, David prayed this prayer. He finally reached a point in his life. David had a lot of highs in his life, and he had a lot of lows in his life. He had a lot of these spiritual highs, seeing all these amazing things in his experience with God, but then he also experienced a lot of lows. A lot of those lows came through his life because why? Because he had not learned how to do the desert with God. He had brought a lot of these problems, these situations on himself. He wasn't truly committed to God at times, we see. Now again, here's a man after God's own heart. God shares that with us, but at the same time, this is what David prayed. He prayed, Father, give me a pure heart. He prayed for God to give him a willing spirit. But he also prayed for God to give him steadfastness. Steadfastness. That's what we're talking about here. Is give me steadfastness. God, in the highs, may I do the highs with you. God, may I do the lows with you. But God, in other words, in everything in my life, may you give me this steadfastness that I can just weave through life in this steadfastness, in my fear of you, that I can just walk with you in the desert and in the promised land. In the desert and the promised land. But here's the thing, there's a lot of people, especially in our culture, society right now, that need a miracle. And when I say that, they need a miracle of allowing and engaging in a relationship with God through Jesus. You see, they didn't recognize who Jesus was. When God spoke through his son Jesus, they didn't recognize him. The nation of Israel, the children of Israel, they didn't recognize Jesus. In fact, they ended up crucifying Jesus. But because of that crucifixion, because of the blood that Jesus shed, because of him dying on the cross, because of him laying in a tomb, because Jesus rose from the dead, there's where the healing takes place. There's where the miraculous, as we surrender our leadership, our lordship over to Jesus. And there's so many people that are needing that healing, that are needing that miraculous, that are needing that miracle in their lives. So last weekend, we put out a challenge for us as a church community. And here's the challenge again to us. Reminder that over the next 3 months, at 3 p.m. every day, we're going to pray for at least 3 people. 3 people, 3 p.m. for 3 months, that they need a miracle in their life. They need the healing power of Jesus in their life. And so what I'm asking is you fill in the blank. It would be a miracle if, and then you put the name, if that individual came to know a relationship with Jesus. And then I want you to immerse them in prayer. I'm asking us as a church community, whether it be online or in person, that we will be praying for 3 people for 3 months at 3 p.m. every day, that God will do a miracle in their lives, that God will move in their lives. Will you join me in this time of prayer? You guys have a great week.